I never thought a train station could feel like a living thing until the night I started working at Lockmere Station. And even now, years later, I can still remember the weight that settled in my chest the first time the big brass clock struck midnight and the platforms emptied out, leaving me alone with only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the groaning creaks of the old building. People think of train stations as loud, bustling places filled with motion and chatter, but at night, when the last of the commuters vanish into the rain-soaked dark, a station becomes something else entirely. An echo chamber where every shuffle of your boot sounds like it belongs to someone following behind, where every drip of water from the ceiling tiles stretches too long and lands too loud, and where the shadows bend in ways they shouldn't under the cold lamps. I took the job because I needed it. That was the simple truth. Rent was late, and debts have their own way of knocking harder than any ghost. The station master, a gaunt man named Cole with sunken cheeks and eyes that never seemed to look directly at you, handed me a laminated card on my first shift and told me to read it aloud. I laughed at first. Rules posted on cards always mean some kind of workplace joke, a hazing ritual meant to scare new hires. But when he didn't smile, when his lips pressed together in a flat line and his hands tightened around the thermos he always carried, I realized I wasn't meant to laugh. The card listed 4 rules, and though they were short, each one left a taste like iron in my mouth. Rule 1, when the 12:07 whistles twice, lock every door except the glass one on platform 3, and no matter what, don't close that door until dawn, even if someone knocks. Rule 2, if a child in a red coat asks for a ticket, tell them no night fares, and never, under any circumstances, look them in the eyes. Rule 3. If the station clock ever strikes 13, pull the iron lever under the ticket desk and hum a hymn until the ringing stops. Never touch the clock's hands. Rule 4. When the train with no number arrives at 2:23, nobody boards. Instead, slide a dime across its threshold, and if the dime turns black, close your eyes, count to 30, and do not open them until the silence returns. I read each line slowly, my own voice trembling like I'd stumbled into someone else's diary. And when I finished, Cole only said, "Keep this place open, keep this place closed. That's your job now," before leaving me alone with the card, the brass bell on the counter, and a pot of coffee that tasted like mud, but kept my hands warm. I told myself rules were just tradition, superstition woven into routine by a century-old building with too much history in its bones. Still, the silence between trains didn't feel like silence at all. It felt like listening, like something heavy breathing just past the walls. I sat at the ticket desk, drumming my fingers against the wood, trying not to think about how the old glass door rattled faintly every time the wind picked up. I tried not to think about the strange weight of the iron lever under the desk, or the smell of old metal that rose from it when my hand brushed too close. At 11:59, the clock coughed out a groan, the second hand twitching like a nerve. And I swear the building sighed, every window pane trembling as if bracing for what was coming. The town outside had gone quiet, not the kind of quiet born from peace, but the kind that comes when everyone knows enough to hide. The train schedules on the wall said I only had to survive 3 arrivals before dawn, but each one of those arrivals came with the promise of a rule, and each rule felt less like advice and more like a lock keeping something worse out. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the chipped mug rattling against the saucer as though even the porcelain was nervous. And I sat there, in the stale glow of the fluorescence, waiting for 12:07, waiting to see if the first rule was a joke or a curse, waiting to discover if I had just agreed to a job or to a bargain with something that owned the night. And when the first whistle came, long, low, and vibrating through the glass, I knew, before the second one echoed, that nothing in those rules was written for fun, and nothing about this station belonged to me. The 12:07 train came the way storms do, not sudden, but inevitable. Its whistle dragging through the night air like an old warning, and when it groaned into the station, brakes screeching, the entire building seemed to lean forward with it, trembling as though the arrival had pulled every nail and beam a fraction closer to the tracks. I did exactly as Rule 1 said, moving room by room, locking every door with fingers that shook just enough to make the keys rattle, leaving only the glass door on platform 3 wedged open by a rubber stopper that looked too fragile to keep anything at bay. And though it felt like I was committing a crime by leaving it exposed, the card in my pocket seemed to burn hotter against my chest, like it was warning me not to test its authority. The last of the passengers shuffled off. Tired men with their collars turned up against the drizzle, women with briefcases clutched to their ribs, a teenager dragging a skateboard that clattered with each step. They all passed through the station without really looking at me, their silence more unnerving than if they had stared, as though they too knew the rules and had decided not to involve themselves with the man foolish enough to work the night shift here. When the platform emptied, the train hissed once, like a sigh, and then it was gone, vanishing into the fog with the kind of speed that makes you wonder if it had ever been there at all. That was when I felt it. The temperature dropped just enough for my breath to haze in front of me. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed louder, and the silence pressed in so tightly it was no longer silence, but a kind of listening, like the station itself was waiting for me to fail. At 12:31, 3 soft knocks tapped against the glass door, polite as a guest, and every hair on my body rose in answer. I told myself it was just a late traveler, someone caught by the rain, but the shape on the other side was wrong. It was tall, too tall, and the crown of its head seemed to stretch above the frame, yet the shoulders sloped too narrowly, like someone had built a man from memory and missed the proportions. The hand that pressed against the pane wasn't really a hand, either. It was thin, too long, the fingers bending like reeds under water, and when it tapped again, the sound was delicate, coaxing, nothing like the desperate pounding of someone locked out of shelter. I wanted to walk forward, to explain, to be the helpful attendant I was supposed to be, but the card whispered in my pocket. The words "no matter what" knocks ringing in my skull like the clock's chime, so I stayed rooted to the ticket desk and called out, "Station's closed," though my voice didn't sound like my own. The hand slid lower, leaving streaks on the glass, as though the fog on the other side had bled through. And then the letters appeared. My name, written slowly, deliberately. W-I-L-I-A-N. My blood froze, because only 3 people in my life had ever spelled it right, and 2 of them were dead.
Them were dead. The letters hung there in the condensation, dripping downward as if carved by something with patience. And though every part of me wanted to bolt, to slam the door shut and lock the world out, the rule anchored me in place. Don't close that door until dawn, no matter what. The silhouette leaned closer, the glass flexing just slightly as though it were breathing, and I swore I saw the faint outline of teeth behind the fog. Too many teeth, stacked wrong, smiling at me like an old friend. My legs betrayed me, stumbling backward until the back of my knees met the wooden counter, and I gripped the edge until my knuckles burned white, whispering under my breath like a man praying without knowing the words. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. The letters smeared down into a shapeless blur, the fog thinned, and when I blinked, the figure was gone, swallowed into the mist outside, leaving me with the ache of adrenaline in my veins and the heavy knowledge that Rule 1 wasn't superstition, it was survival. I stood there shaking, my breath fogging the air, and tried not to think about what would have happened if I'd given in, opened that door and answered my name. By the time the station clock crawled past midnight, I had almost convinced myself that the figure at the glass door was just a trick of fatigue and fog. But then I heard the sound of rubber soles squeaking against tile, faint but deliberate. And when I turned my head, a child stood at the ticket window, as though they had always been there, small, still, the hood of a bright red coat drawn low enough that shadows drowned the face beneath, hands folded on the counter like they were waiting for Sunday service. I never heard the door open, never heard footsteps approach, just the soft sound of being noticed. My throat tightened because Rule 2 had prepared me for this moment with cruel precision. If a child in a red coat asks for a ticket, say "no night fares," and never look them in the eyes. Simple words, but the kind of rule that hints at disaster if you falter. and I understood in my bones that faltering was exactly what the station wanted from me. The child's voice came low and calm, rehearsed. "One to home, please." And the words made my skin crawl, because children don't talk like that, not with such measured politeness, not like they've said it 1,000 times before. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth, but I forced the words out, quiet as prayer. No night fares. I fixed my gaze at the timetable behind the child's head, at the crooked "no smoking" sign, at the pencil cup on the counter, anywhere but the dark well of the hood. For a heartbeat, the child said nothing, just stood still enough that I wondered if it could breathe. Then, a coin clinked against the wood, rolling lazily until it tapped the glass between us. I stared at it, refusing to move. "Please," the child whispered, and that word carried a weight that nearly broke me, because it was not just a request. It was the exact tone my sister used the day she drowned, asking me to wait for her, begging me to stay, a memory sharp enough to bleed into the present. My hand twitched, desperate to reach for the coin, desperate to grant mercy where I had once failed. But I remembered the card burning in my pocket and snapped my gaze to the cracked edge of the countertop, counting splinters. 1, 2, 3, 4, until the urge passed. That was when it said my name, William, not asked, not guessed, but spoken with the cold confidence of someone who had it stitched into their throat. My heart hammered so loud I could hear it in my teeth, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered in rhythm with it, the room dipping into momentary darkness that stretched too long. The coin rolled back across the counter by itself, slow and sure, and fell toward the floor, but it never struck tile. It hung in the air an inch above the ground, trembling as though the very air had turned thick around it before drifting backward into the hood and vanishing completely. My stomach turned over in revolt, and I gripped the ticket desk until I thought the wood might splinter under my hands. The child did not move, did not breathe, only stood there in that red coat that seemed too vivid for the pale fluorescent light, a stain of impossible color against the gray night. "No night fares," I repeated, my voice cracking like old paint, and I backed away, step by trembling step, until the iron lever under the desk dug into my thigh. The hood tilted, as if studying me, and then it was gone. No footsteps, no sound of doors, no dispersal of fabric or shadow. 1 second it existed, the next, the station was empty again, except for me, the humming lights, and the stale taste of fear souring my tongue. I sank into the chair behind the counter and buried my face in my hands, the words echoing through my skull like a curse, realizing with a clarity that felt like teeth against my spine, the rules weren't about surviving the station, they were about surviving myself, because all it wanted, all it ever wanted, was for me to look. By 1:40, the station had gone so still I could hear the blood in my ears, and that's when the old brass clock above the concourse began to twitch, the second hand stuttering like a nervous eye and then jerking forward in spasms until the whole thing gave a shuddering cough and struck once, twice, 3 times. Not the measured hours, but something sickly, uneven. And when the 12th strike rolled out, I already knew what was coming, because the rule had carved itself into my skull. If the station clock strikes 13, pull the iron lever under the desk and hum a hymn until the ringing stops. Do not touch the hands. The 13th strike rang out like a hammer against bone, so deep I felt it in my teeth, and I scrambled under the desk with knees shaking, groping for the lever. My fingers found cold iron and pulled, and the whole station groaned as though its foundations had shifted. The sound of the bell didn't stop, 14, 15, 16 rolling out endlessly, and I forced myself to hum the only hymn I knew, the one my mother used to sing while she scrubbed dishes, about still waters and green pastures, my voice cracking with fear but rising loud enough to fight the vibrations that made the window glass rattle in their frames. By the 9th chime, the fluorescent bulb sputtered and filled the air with the smell of burning dust, By the 10th, my eyes blurred with tears that came without my permission, and by the 11th, the glass door on platform 3 trembled on its wedge, bowing inward like something was pressing its forehead against the other side. At 12, the whole building felt like it was holding its breath, and when 13 rolled over again, deep and patient, the hymn caught in my throat and nearly died, but I dragged it back, humming louder, desperate, my voice raw and shaking like it belonged to a child. That was when I heard it, the sound of someone else humming back, not from inside the station, but from beyond the open door. A voice, low
and patient, matching me note for note, like an echo twisted into companionship. My chest seized, my body screaming to slam the door shut, to grab the clock's hands and force them back, but the rules burned hotter in my mind than fear itself, and I hummed on, tears running down my face, until finally, the chimes slowed. The 13th toll stretched into silence, and the clock settled itself stubbornly at 1:44. I slumped against the counter, my throat aching, my hands numb from gripping the lever so hard, and listened as the last fragments of the echo faded away, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like a body standing over me. I didn't dare look at the door. I didn't dare breathe too loudly. I just pressed a trembling hand to the rules card in my pocket, as if it might anchor me to the side of the world that still made sense. And in that moment, I realized the truth that chilled me more than the strikes themselves. The rules weren't meant to keep the strangeness out. They were meant to teach it how to behave, to bargain with whatever pressed against the edges of this place. And I was no longer sure which of us was obeying which. By the time the hands of the brass clock crawled toward 2:20, my nerves were already flayed raw, every shadow in the corners looking too deliberate, every hum of the light fixtures carrying a note I swore didn't belong to electricity. And though I wanted to tell myself I could hold on until dawn, I knew what the rules promised next, the one that had seemed the most absurd when Cole first read it to me. When the train with no number arrives at 2:23, nobody boards. Instead, slide a dime across its threshold, and if it blackens, close your eyes and count to 30. My chest tightened as the rails began their whisper, a subtle vibration in the soles of my boots before the sound swelled into a growl that rose up through the floorboards of the station. And then the fog thickened on platform 3, parting just enough to reveal a black shape coalescing into a train that seemed less built than remembered. There was no headlight, no engine markings, just a long line of matte dark cars whose windows reflected nothing. No lamps, no platform, not even me standing there frozen with the dime sweating in my hand. The air tasted of damp metal and cellar dust. And the moment those doors opened with a sigh like lungs collapsing, I felt the temperature drop so sharply I saw frostbite across the edge of the platform. I knelt, breath clouding in front of me, and with a trembling thumb pushed the dime forward until it slid across the threshold. The sound it made was wrong, stretched, like metal dragged underwater. And when it stopped moving, the dime sizzled, the silver darkening into a color I can only describe as absence, a black so deep it swallowed the yellowed light and gave nothing back. My body wanted to run, but the rule hammered in my skull, and I shut my eyes hard enough that stars danced behind my lids, whispering numbers aloud to keep my sanity tethered. 1, 2, 3. The air thickened like syrup, so heavy I thought my chest would cave. 4, 5, 6. The sound of something breathing close enough to move the hairs on my arm made my throat lock. 7, 8, 9. Whispering voices circled me, but the words ran backward, all consonants and static. 10, 11, 12. A hand, or something shaped like one, hovered so near my cheek I could feel its cold soak into my jaw. 13 through 20 felt like dragging my body across gravel with no limbs. At 21, the cold receded an inch,
Something unwillingly giving me space?
At 27, the platform lights flickered, warming the skin on my face again. And at 30, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and opened my eyes just as the doors were sealing with a final hiss, the black train already unraveling back into fog, dissolving until only the rails hummed in their absence. The dime lay there at the edge of the platform, flat and blackened, bleeding darkness like ink into the grooves of the track. And I didn't touch it. I couldn't. Because in that moment, I understood the rule's real cruelty. It hadn't told me to keep my eyes shut to protect myself, but to protect me from seeing who or what had leaned so close in those 30 seconds. And I knew deep down I wasn't strong enough to survive the sight. After the black train dissolved into fog and the last hiss of its brakes faded into a silence too deliberate to be natural, I staggered back inside the station, half dizzy from holding my breath and half drunk on the dread that clung to me like smoke. And I poured coffee I didn't want into a chipped mug, just to give my hands something to do, anything but tremble. But the taste was bitter ash that made my stomach lurch, so I set it aside and went rummaging under the ticket desk, desperate for distraction, when my fingers brushed against something thick, bound, and dust-caked. An old leather ledger tied with a blue ribbon frayed to threads. I pulled it out, laid it on the counter, and when I opened it, the smell hit me first. Mold, library dust, and something sharp beneath, like iron that had tasted blood. The first pages were ordinary, entries about train schedules and ticket counts dated back to 1911, the ink curling an elaborate hand. But halfway through, the tone shifted, every line leaner, sharper, as if the writer feared even writing the words might invite notice. Rules were listed then, not unlike the laminated card Cole gave me, but the ledger described them as revisions after incidents, each tied to a name and a note that read like a headstone. One name, Ruth Holloway, broke Rule 1, open to a woman crying on Platform 3. Found the next dawn, body on the tracks, face pressed against glass from the inside. Another, Charles Dent, broke Rule 2, asked the redcoat its mother's name. Resigned at dawn, no forwarding address, home abandoned, plates still set on the table. And then Henry Lowell broke Rule 3, touched the hands of the clock, struck 13 for 1 hour, every town dog howled, took 3 men to pull him off the lever, still hums hymns in his sleep, lips cracked, eyes blind to daylight. I turned pages faster, the entries like nails in my chest, names scratched out, margins filled with desperate handwriting. The door must remain open until dawn. The train must be paid with coin. The children must be refused. The clock must never be touched. Someone had pressed a brittle wildflower between pages, 40 years apart, a dried violet crumbling into my lap as if it had been waiting for my hands to free it. The later entries were written in Cole's sharp block letters, concise, almost military. Remember, the station is not only a gate for trains, but for other things. We serve both by honoring one. Below it, he had taped a Polaroid, the image faint but enough to set my teeth on edge. The glass door on Platform 3 propped open at dawn, and in its reflection, a second door faintly visible, like a hall of mirrors leading somewhere darker. I felt my stomach hollow out as I traced the ink, realizing these rules weren't born of paranoia. They were born of blood, of mistakes paid in screams.
For in bodies and vanishings, a chain of workers like me, each keeping the bargain one night at a time. My hand rested on the ledger longer than I meant to, a quiet thanks to the forgotten names, and I felt the wood of the counter pulse faintly beneath my palm, as though the station itself approved, or perhaps was amused. Either way, I knew then what I hadn't wanted to believe until that moment. The rules weren't protection in the way you think locks protect a house. They were rituals, stitched bargains that taught the station how to keep its hungers orderly, and I wasn't guarding people from trains at all. I was keeping something older from stepping too freely into the world, and the longer I sat in that chair, the more I wondered if I was guarding the world from it, or if I was guarding it from me. Around 3 in the morning, the station was so still that I could hear the groan of the rails cooling in the fog, each ping of metal like a heartbeat too far away to belong to me, and just when I thought I had settled into that rhythm of dread,
A cough broke the silence. Two short, one long, and it froze me because it was my father's cough. The same sound he made every evening after supper when he wanted a cigarette but didn't want my mother to scold him, and I turned, slow and unwilling, toward the far bench beneath the timetable, and there he was, my father, hat in his hands, knee jiggling just like it always did when he was restless, eyes fixed on me with a weight that cut straight through years of dirt and coffin wood. For a moment my chest cracked open with grief and something dangerous spilled out, because I hadn't seen his face since the day we buried him, and he looked good. Too good. Skin smooth, eyes clear. Not the hollow man sickness had left behind, but the younger version I remembered from childhood photographs, and that was the first sign it was wrong. He smiled and said, "You always work too late, son." And the word son hit me like a knife dipped in honey, sweet and cruel at once, because that word had built my bones, and now it was in a mouth that shouldn't exist anymore. The rules card in my pocket throbbed like a second heart, reminding me that temptation never announces itself, it just sits where you're weakest. I stayed behind the ticket desk, fingers gripping the ledger like a shield, and I didn't move. "Come sit with me," he said, his voice soft as a winter coat. "Let me tell you what the doctor didn't." His voice was comfort and wrought at the same time, pulling me forward inch by inch, my body aching to close the distance, to hear the secrets I thought death had buried with him, but somewhere deep down, the part of me that had obeyed the rules this long whispered that this was no reunion. It was bait. "You did good with the hymn," he added, tilting his head like he'd been listening all along, and I felt the air around the lever grow cold, like the station was daring me to step out from behind it. "I could teach you another. You just have to walk with me a moment." Behind him, the glass door on platform 3 shivered on its wedge, fog pressing hard against it like breath against a pane, and in that breath I swore I smelled my father's truck after rain and cigarettes. Every memory sharpened into a knife I almost wanted to grab by the blade. My mouth trembled with words I wanted to say, apologies, questions, anything, but instead I forced out the only phrase I trusted: "No night fares." He chuckled, a sound that was my father's, and then wasn't, bending into something thinner, sharper, and he turned his head toward the tracks where the fog curved
into a pale road that led nowhere I wanted to go. "You'll learn," he said, his teeth catching the platform light wrong, and then he blurred at the edges, dissolving into the mist the way a painting disappears when you step too close. My knees gave out and I sank into the chair, sweat cold on my back, heart hammering with grief and fury, and I understood what the rules really demanded. They weren't about ghosts or monsters outside. They were about the war inside me, the things I longed for, the things I would give anything to see again. And the station knew it, used it, and waited like a predator for me to slip. It must have been close to 3:10 when I felt the change again, that prickle along the nape of my neck that warned me I was no longer alone. And when I looked up from the ledger, the air itself seemed to bend at the edge of my vision, the hum of the lights thinning out, and there she was again, the child in the red coat, standing not at the ticket window this time, but in the middle of the concourse, as though she had simply stepped out of the air, her hood tilted down, her small hands hanging loose at her sides. I could see the wet sheen of the coat even though the floor beneath her was bone dry, and before I could draw breath, she spoke in that same calm, patient voice. "I dropped my coin. Will you help me find it?" Her voice slid into me like a hook, tugging at something too tender, and I knew what the rules demanded. Knew I should turn my gaze away and repeat the phrase that was supposed to keep me safe, but grief is a sharper knife than fear, and her voice wasn't her voice anymore. It was my sister's, soft and quivering, just as it had been the day she slipped beneath that pond when I was supposed to be watching her, begging me to wait, begging me not to let go. And suddenly the station wasn't a station at all, but the memory of that day. The sunlight fractured on the water, the sound of her last please stitched into my chest. My head turned before I could stop it, my eyes searching beneath the hood, and that was the mistake. The crack in the wall the station had been waiting for, because inside that hood there was no child's face, no sister's smile, only 2 polished steel tracks curving forever into darkness, circling like eyes that didn't blink. And on those tracks tiny figures moved, shapes of hands slipping beneath weeds, shadows of small bodies caught between rails that never ended. My knees buckled and I fell against the ticket racks, paper scattering like frightened birds, my breath tearing out of me as the lights flickered above, the brass clock coughing on its own rhythm, as if it too wanted to betray me. I tried to wrench my gaze away, but the hood seemed to hold me, pressing that endless corridor of tracks into my eyes until my stomach lurched and I thought I would vomit. Somewhere in the fog of it all, I heard her say, "I can give it back." And I didn't know if she meant the coin, or the years, or my sister herself, but my hands shook with the desperate hunger to say yes, to bargain, to let her pour that lie into me. Instead, I gasped, "No night fares," the words breaking into a sob, and I clawed backward until my hand found the cold bite of the iron lever beneath the desk. I yanked it down with a scream, the whole station buckling like a ship under weight, and the brass clock answered with 13 strikes that rang like thunder through my skull. I hummed, not the hymn I'd used before, but the lullaby my mother used to sing while cutting my hair in the kitchen. Nonsense words trembling on my tongue, the only shield I could manage.
The red coat wavered in the flicker of the lights, her hood tilting just once, like disappointment or pity, before the shape bled away into smoke. I collapsed against the desk, my chest burning, knowing I had broken Rule 2, knowing the ledger would record me as another name who faltered, but also knowing the truth the card never dared print, that the rules don't just guard you from what waits outside the station, they guard you from the ghosts inside your own chest, and once you break, the station knows exactly how to use you. The moment I pulled that lever and the clock gave its traitorous 13th strike, I knew I had shattered more than silence. I had shattered the fragile truce that kept this place balanced, and the air around me thickened like wet cloth, heavy with a pressure that pressed down on my chest until every breath scraped like broken glass. But I kept humming, desperate and cracked, my mother's nonsense lullaby spilling out of me like a bleeding wound. And the vibrations in the station shifted, the brass bell above the desk rattling as if it remembered it had a purpose. My hand shot out, grabbed its handle, and I rang it once. Twice, its hollow clang ricocheted through the concourse, and the sound didn't feel like sound at all. It felt like light in the dark, pushing back shadows that writhed along the walls. The redcoat's absence was not peace, it was a pause, a breath before something worse. And in that breath I knew I had to repair what I had broken, because the rules had been bent and something was testing the edges. The blackened dime still lay on the platform from the numberless train, a smear of void against honest metal, and with shaking legs I staggered out to platform 3, the fog clinging to me like wet fabric, whispering with the voices of children I'd never met but somehow knew. Their laughter bent backward into sobs. I knelt, my hands trembling as I nudged the dime with my boot back across the threshold, leaving a dark streak that seemed to smolder even without fire. And I whispered into the fog, "No trades tonight, no fares, no bargains," my voice cracking, but carrying into the dark like a plea scratched on the air. The station groaned in reply, a low rumble that made the lamp sway overhead, and I swore I saw the glass door flex as though something was pressing its forehead against it from the other side. But the wench held, and the rules, battered though they were, still held some sway. My lungs ached with the effort of humming, but I did not stop because the air behind me was wrong now, wet with breath that wasn't mine, carrying the scent of soil turned too long under rain. When I finally turned, the concourse was crawling with movement at the edges, limbs too long, hands dragging along the tile like spiders feeling their way forward, and in the middle of them the brass clock quivered, its hands spinning too fast, landing on numbers that didn't exist before jolting back to 1. I rang the bell again, 3 times now, its voice carrying into those shadows, and the movement froze, as if caught mid-step, the limbs twitching in place, the outlines blurred like half-developed photographs. "You looked," a voice whispered. And it wasn't from the red coat anymore, it came from the station itself, from the rafters, from the wires in the walls, a chorus of grief that knew my weakness. "We all look, then we all pay," I rasped back, though my throat was raw, though every instinct begged me to run, because I knew running was just another way of opening the wrong door. I dragged myself back behind the tick desk, forcing my trembling body into the chair, and pressed my forehead to the rules card in my pocket, whispering the words like scripture until the trembling in the air thinned. Slowly, impossibly, the clock settled back into the honest lie of 3:14. The shadows bled back into the corners, and the station released a breath that smelled like rust and old rain, leaving me alive but cracked,
Another name scrawled in that ledger for breaking a rule and still crawling back. I didn't feel victorious. I felt marked, like the station had measured me and now knew exactly where to press when it wanted me to fail again. By the time the horizon began to gray at the edges, I was so wrung out I could barely tell if the humming in my throat was still real or just the ghost of it vibrating in my skull. But the air in the station had softened, the way a fever eases just before breaking. And when I glanced at the brass clock, it read 4:57, its hands calm, steady, like it hadn't tried to betray me an hour earlier. Platform 3 was still open, the glass door yawning into the fog, and I stood there watching as the first smear of pink scraped itself across the bricks. The light tentative but honest, and I nudged the rubber wedge out with my boot so the door finally closed with a sigh, the latch catching like the station had been waiting all night for permission to rest. My body sagged in relief, but it wasn't peace. It was a reprieve, and I knew it. The way a wounded animal knows the predator will circle back eventually. When Station Master Cole arrived with his dented thermos, his face was its usual unreadable mask, but his eyes flicked past me, scanning the walls, the floor, the platform, like a man who knows that the evidence of the night clings like soot even after the fire dies. And then he nodded once, as if satisfied that I hadn't let the whole place burn down. I didn't wait for him to ask. I slid the ledger across the desk already open to a blank page and said, voice rough from hours of humming, "At me." He studied me for a moment, long enough that I felt like he was measuring how much of me had been eaten, and then he scrawled in his sharp block letters, William Reyes, broke Rule 2, looked at the red coat, rang the bell, pulled the lever, kept the doors correct. Seeing my name etched alongside the others sent a chill through me, not because I hadn't expected it, but because I had joined a lineage, a chain of the damned and the stubborn who had kept this place stitched together one night at a time. Cole tore a strip from his yellow pad, slid it to me, and said, "Everyone leaves an addendum. That's how the rules grow." My hand shook as I wrote, the words carving themselves onto the paper before I could doubt them. If the red coat knows your name, speak it before it does. Names belong where we put them. I taped it beneath the laminated card, and the rules seemed to breathe heavier for it, like the station itself approved of the addition, or maybe just enjoyed collecting the scraps of our sanity. When I stepped out onto the platform again, the block and dime was gone, replaced by an ordinary silver one, bright as if it had been freshly minted, lying harmlessly in the grooves of the track, and I bent down, palmed it, feeling its warmth seep into me as if the night's bargain had been wiped clean. Commuters began trickling in, yawning, scrolling on their phones, their laughter ringing too lightly, too human, and for the first time all night, the station looked like what it pretended to be. Just a building that kept people moving, a throat that swallowed mornings and coughed up destinations. But as I watched them step over the spot where fog had curled, where children had whispered, where a train with no number had demanded a payment from me, I felt that dime heavy in my palm and knew the truth the ledger never spelled out. The rules are not about survival for one night. They're about shaping you into someone who belongs to the station, someone who learns how to keep the line taut without asking what happens if it ever snaps. When Cole finally looked at me again, his eyes caught mine with something close to pity, and he said, "You'll last," like a blessing and a curse at once. I didn't answer. I just slipped the dime into my pocket beside the rules card, feeling both heavier than any coin or scrap of paper should be, and I thought about the door, the coat, the clock, the train, all of it, and understood with a clarity that hollowed me out. The night wasn't the test. I was. And dawn didn't mean I'd won. It meant I'd been accepted into the long list of names who now carried the burden of keeping the station's hunger in check. When the sun finally claimed Lockmere, when the bricks warmed and the commuters laughed about their phones and their coffees, I sat behind the desk pretending to be a man who had only sold tickets all night. But I knew better. And the ledger knew better. The station had tested me and I had broken, but not completely. That dime still rides in my pocket. Warm some nights, cold on others, and I swear it vibrates when the wind picks up. People ask me if I like the night shift. I smile and say, it's quiet. Quiet is a lie. Quiet is where the rules live. And the rules don't end when dawn comes. They sit with you, follow you home, whisper your name just to see if you'll look. Some nights I think about quitting, about walking away and letting the station find another fool. But then I remember the names in the ledger, the ones who faltered and the ones who vanished, and I know the truth. Once the station writes you down, you don't leave. You just keep the doors correct until your line runs out. And if you ever find yourself waiting for a train at Lockmere in the small hours, don't wander. Don't stare too long at the glass door on platform 3. And if a child in a red coat asks you for a ticket, remember my voice, because I'll be whispering with the rest of them. No night fares. If you enjoyed this story and you want more nights like these, don't forget. This is Echoes After Midnight. We tell the strange, the dark, and the mysterious every single week. Subscribe, top the bell, and keep the rules close because the next story may already be waiting on your platform.